not the main issue. So, a very good evening to all of you present here. I, Dr. Krishna Sinhamahapatra, welcome you to the fourth lecture in the lecture series on the topic literary criticism. So, you can see my screen before you, wherein I have my details. So you can refer to my details for further contact. You can get the details of my channel, wherein you can connect with me after the lecture. As of now, we are having a live session. So if you have any questions, any points to be discussed, you can put it up in the chat box, which is there for the live chat. So we have already started our discussion on literary criticism, and today we are in the fourth lecture, wherein we have started discussion on literary criticism in the very first lecture of ours, wherein in literary theory series we discussed what is literature, we discussed what is literary theory and what is literary criticism, how literary criticism is actually a practical application of the different concepts and ideas which are there in different critics' mind, how the very idea of criticism is about stating the positives and negatives of the different things which we see around us. Similarly, literary criticism, as the name suggests, it is the criticism of different texts or of different writers or of the different genres which these texts belong to. So we have discussed the origin of literary criticism and the classical origin of it, and then we have discussed the neoclassical aspects of it, and today we are going to continue from where we were left yesterday. It was not yesterday, but on Friday we had the session. So a continuation of our Friday's session. Due to some reason, not able to go to the next slide. Just a minute. Yes, so now we can navigate. So the lecture 4, as I was saying, will be a continuation of what we did in the last lecture. The lecture is already there in the lecture series, which is there with BARTI online. So we have started our discussion on romantic age critics of literary criticism, and that is what we are going to do today in details, so that our understanding of this particular age critics is very clear. These poets are also very, very famous, as you know, William Wordsworth or Coleridge. All of you, as you're preparing for your NetSet examination for English, their poetry is very, very significant, and hence an understanding of their psychology, of their way of understanding of criticism is important as well. Again, there is some internet issue. It's not going on to the next slide. So I'm just connecting with another network, and I hope it will work better. Yes. So I'm sharing my screen once again. Let me know if it is visible. Yes. So we have discussed this part, and as we were discussing, the first critic whom we are going to take up is William Wordsworth. We have already started our discussion on Wordsworth, and we are going to carry forward the discussion. Yes, I hope it's visible now and I'm audible as well. So, William Wordsworth. When I'm sharing the screen, it's not working. So, we'll just check that if I'm not sharing my entire screen, if I can navigate. If it's possible, then I will not share my entire screen and go ahead in this way. Yes, so it's now working. So sorry for this delay because of the connectivity issue. So romantic criticism, as we know, has begun with whom? With William Wordsworth. And this idea of romantic criticism or romanticism actually started after the French Revolution, because we know that French Revolution brought in a whole new, kind of surge of ideas, and romanticism came ahead or came across as a part of this new change. So it shattered the old way of life, and it discredited the old hierarchies, the things which were already there, which were preferred earlier, which were accepted earlier. So these accepted realities were questioned, and the old hierarchies were questioned with this new kind of zeal of life. So it proclaimed the very most important thing, which is important for all of us, which is rights of man. So it kind of reinstated the importance of kind of looking forward to what role a man plays in the things which go around us, rather than any other factors. So it liberated the man from class divisions. So the society which was kind of divided based on class, that kind of man, that kind of existence, that kind of reality was changed. The equation was changed by the liberation of man, wherein we are talking about human beings in general, right? So no longer regarded kings and princes the noblest subject of poetry. So the subject of poetry went about or got a revolution. There was it slowly, the subject of poetry, instead of being based on the people in power like kings and princes, slowly it moved on to the normal common people. So the kings and princes were not considered as the ideal subjects of poetry anymore. There was a change in that. No longer kept decorum as the special purpose of the poet. So decorum was not kept as the special purpose of the poet. So they were coming up with new rules, they were coming up with new ideas of what can be the subject of poetry. As a result, there was a whole new way of looking at poetry with the romantic age of literary criticism and literary, rather literature. So according to Wordsworth, the principal object of poetry is, so what is the principal object? To choose incidents and situations from common life. So dear students, you have to keep in mind that the shift which we are talking about is here. What is here? That the incidents and situations of common life, right? Next, the next very significant changes to select language really used by men. When we are saying language really used by men, it is actually talking about the rustic, normal language used by common people. Rather, as we were discussing, he preferred language used by farmers. He preferred language used by people living in the countryside, that is, in the villages, near to nature, rather than the highly sophisticated, civilized language which is being spoken by people from the city. So he preferred that to throw a certain coloring of imagination, whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. So it is not that we are reading about something very unusual, but according to Wordsworth. So we have to remember, when we are discussing here, we are discussing Wordsworth's point of view. So according to Wordsworth, he was talking about ordinary things to be presented in an unusual way, unusual aspect. To make these incidents and situations interesting by tracing in them the primary laws of our nature. So, to make these incidents and situations interesting. And how to make them interesting? Interesting by tracing. Tracing in the sense trying to find in them what? The primary laws of our nature. So what is given importance? Nature. So we have to remember, with romantic age, what became important is that romantic literature gave importance to nature. Romantic critics, they gave importance to nature. So these things became very, very important, because given the context in which romantic poetry and these things were written, industrialization and the kind of effects of people going away from nature was very much prevalent. So the critics and the poets, they wanted to bring about a very significant kind of focus on nature. The language of poetry. So how was the language of poetry viewed? What kind of language of poetry? So the romantic view of what language the poet used is completely different from that of the neoclassicists or the neoclassicists. So the neoclassical writers avoided what? Rustic language. What kind of language they used? The language they used, which was full of specific, tone and specific kind of status was given to the language used by the neoclassical writers. They attempt to refine and polish ordinary language. However, the poetic diction has been replaced by ordinary speech when in the romantic age, where the romantic writers, poets, they are writing. So they are including ordinary speech. So the romantics use the language of ordinary men, especially the rustics. So what we have to keep in mind is that there was a shift in the use of language, and what kind of language was important? The rustic language, that is the very common language of the ordinary common people, which was avoided by the neoclassical writers, but the ordinary speech and the rustic language was welcomed by the romantic age writers. So romantic view of what language the poet should use is completely different from that of the neoclassicists. The neoclassicists avoided rustic language. They attempted to refine and polish ordinary language. Thus poetic diction has replaced now by the ordinary speech. The romantics use the language of ordinary men, especially rustics. Wordsworth is not interested in the manners of those who live in the city, as we were discussing. He was not interested in the refined language spoken in the city and in the court. What he wanted was that he wanted the normal, ordinary language which is spoken by the rustics, that is the common people. So he wants poetry to deal with the essential passions of the heart. So what did he want the poetry to deal with? He wanted the poetry to deal with the essential passions of the human heart. And this is where, the importance of the idea of emotion comes up. So the language of poetry, man in nature is better than man in the city. So he was focusing on what? He was focusing on the man in nature, and he was not focusing on the man in the city. So Wordsworth was talking about the man in nature. Why? Because of the passions of men in nature are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. So the reason why he was focusing on the man in nature and not in the man in the city is because, you know, the man in nature, he felt, was full of passions, and that passion was directed by the beauty and the permanent forms of nature. So the man in nature was informed by the beauty of the heart of a man who is there in nature. So Wordsworth considers the language of the farmers as the best because they communicate with the best objects from which the best part of language is originally derived. So the main reason why he was focusing on the language of a human being, a man who was in nature, was because he felt that they could communicate with the best objects from which the best part of language is originally derived. So Wordsworth rejects the neoclassical rules of poetic diction. What does he reject? He rejects the neoclassical idea of poetic diction, which we have already discussed. So the poetic diction, in the sense, the specific language which is used in order to make or create poetry. So he rejects that. For him, these rules are what? These rules are artificial. Wordsworth defines good poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So I've already told you this, and I'm telling you again that you need to know this particular expression, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. If possible, you should kind of read his prefaces and his works in details in original. If not, then at least the important lines, important expressions which are there, you should be aware of them. That who has said this? Please write the name of the critic, write the name of the poet, from whose work has it been taken, which work has it been taken. So you should know the important lines which have been said by the important critic. So good poetry, according to Wordsworth, is not the utterance of commonplaces in metrical language, but what it is basically the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So according to Wordsworth, the poet is no longer the singer or of the great or the teacher of the polite etiquette. The poet is a man speaking to men, a man endowed with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness. So what kind of a person? A man speaking to men. That is, there is a communication which is very clear, which is just like water, which is a man speaking to men. A man endowed with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness. A man who has a greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind. So a man who has a greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind. And how is that possible? By the fact that a man who knows more about human nature, how a human being works, and a more comprehensive soul than just any other ordinary person. A man pleased with his own passions and volitions, that is his desires. So a man who is happy with himself, a man who rejoices more than other men in the spirit of life that is in him. That is a man who finds peace with him. So in today's age, most of the times we are not at all happy with ourselves. We do not find peace in our own heart. We are all the time sad and depressed. So he is talking about a man who rejoices, that is, who is happy more than any other man. And he is happy in the spirit of life that is in him. That is, he is happy in himself. So a man who enjoys to contemplate similar volitions and passions as manifested in the goings on of the universe and habitually impelled to create them where he does not find them. So a man who enjoys to contemplate similar desires and similar passions as manifested in the activities of the universe and habitually impelled to create them where he does not find them. So creating similar happiness which one gets in the universe, creating them where one does not find them. So where you cannot get that, where you cannot get that happiness, a poet creates that. So that is the power which a poet has. Wordsworth defines poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. The emotion is contemplated till by a species of reaction. The tranquility gradually disappears and an emotion kindred so that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced and does itself actually exist in the mind. So we have to remember this quotation very well because it kind of sums up the main idea which Wordsworth wants to convey in relation to what he means by poetry. So it is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, not just normal mundane feelings, but very powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. So you go to a place, for example, you go to the beach and then you collect some shells and you love those things and you kind of give collect those shells, but they are still, you forget to bring them, they are still there in the shores only. Now you come back home and you are sitting down in your chair and you are kind of remembering that joy which you had when you were near the sea, you were in the any of the Konkan islands and then any one of the Konkan beaches rather, and then you were collecting shells, you were making small sand dunes, you were making some shapes, you were in the waves and you enjoyed nature to the best. Now today you are sitting in your own room and you are kind of referring back to that moment which had happened in your life, and those emotions are getting recollected in tranquility. When you are alone, you are sitting in your own chair and you are remembering those thoughts. So that is the source of poetry according to Wordsworth. So the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, it takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. The emotion is contemplated till by a species of reaction. The tranquility gradually disappears and an emotion kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced and does itself actually exist in the mind. So that kind of feelings, that kind of emotion which you have in your mind, which you feel once you try to remember or you try to recollect the things which made you very, very happy, some part of nature which made you very, very happy. And when you are remembering that when you are alone, that is actually giving you the source of the idea of poetry according to Wordsworth. So according to Wordsworth, the process of poetic creation goes as follows. Number one, what is number one? The number one, the poet looks at the nature. So all of you must have gone to a hill station or to the sea. So you can remember when you go and see something which is beautiful in nature. After that, what happens? His emotions are aroused. So when you see something very beautiful, your emotions are aroused. Then what you do? In tranquility, he recalls his emotions. So after you return from that place, in tranquility, when you are alone, you recall these emotions. And then what happens? These emotions are made into a poem with the help of images of those things in nature which aroused the poet's emotions in the first place. So the emotions are transformed into the form of a poem with the help of what? With the help of images of those things in nature which aroused the poet's emotions in the first place. So all these things which you actually experience, that stays with you and that takes the form of a poetry. The reader, what happens? The reader looks at the poem and the images of nature. The images of nature in the poem alight with the poet's emotions, arouse in the reader emotions similar to those of the poet, which the poet had in the first place. Now, after you have written a poem, you have transformed your emotions into a poem. Now, anybody who is reading that poem also gets transported into that world. So you will see that we like to read novel, we like to read short stories, or we like to read poetry or a drama, because when we are reading it seriously, what happens? We also get transported in that world. When the poet is saying that my heart danced, then our heart also dances. If the poet is or the writer feels sad, then we also feel sad with that writer or that particular poet, because we can feel that emotion which the poet is trying to share with us. So this is the entire process which Wordsworth wants to tell us regarding how we should write, or how, what is the creative process of creating poetry, and how we respond to poetry. So, in short, the poet looks at nature, his emotions are aroused, and then in tranquility, when he is alone, he recalls those emotions. Those emotions take the form of a poem with the help of images of those things in nature, which arouse the poet's emotions in the first place. The reader looks at the poem, the images of nature in the poem alight with the poet's emotions, arouse in the reader emotions similar to those the poet had in the first place. What is Wordsworth's view of meter? The next point which we are going to discuss. Wordsworth's revolt is against the neoclassical artificial poetic diction. So we have to remember that this romantic age of poetry came as a reaction to neoclassical age of poetry, wherein Wordsworth, as a symbol of that, as one of the proponents of that, is stating that he is against the neoclassical artificial poetic diction. So what does he state? He states that there is no essential difference between the language of prose and the metrical composition. He has attacked meter as an artificial method. So he is stating that meter is nothing but an artificial method. There is, however, the problem of the use of meter in poetry, which in itself causes a distinction between the language of prose and poetry. The fact is that Wordsworth's views on poetic diction and on the use of meter in poetry are not in harmony with one another and appear contradictory. So, in basic idea, what we have to understand is that he was against the neoclassical artificial poetic diction, and he felt that there is not much difference between the language of prose and poetry just because of metrical composition. He attacks meter as an artificial method, and hence he said that, or rather he focused more on what the poetry would be like rather than on the use of the idea of meter. Now what we will do, we are going to do a little bit of study of his preface to the lyrical ballads, which is kind of base of his literary criticism. So Preface to the Lyrical Ballads was written by William Wordsworth and is a landmark essay in the history of English literature. And it is a landmark, so you will see that everywhere you read about Wordsworth, there will be reference to Preface to Lyrical Ballads and how, it actually kind of changed the course of poetry and how it actually kind of, brought about a new change in the way the idea of subject of poetry, lyrical ballads, and any kind of lyric which is written was done. So considered to be the romantic manifesto on poetry and society, the preface is a work that is crucial, that is very important to our understanding of the progress of the romantic literary thought originating in the 18th century Europe, which has been immortalized in our view of poetry and how we think of it today. So the preface to the lyrical ballads first appeared in the second edition of the poetry collection. So the preface came or was published in the as a kind of preface to the lyrical ballads with the second edition of the lyrical ballads, which came in 1801. Though we know that lyrical ballads was originally published in which year? In 1798, which marks the beginning of romantic age of romantic age of literature. If we are not even considering about literary criticism, but the romantic age of literature, right? With the publication of lyrical ballads in 1798. Now, preface to the lyrical ballads comes to the fore with the second edition of the lyrical ballads, which is published in 1801 and which later expanded in the third edition, which is 1802. And it is this preface which is important for our study as we are reading literary criticism, because it gives a kind of window to understand what was Wordsworth's view regarding his kind of, his views regarding poetry, which was the base of his writing. So it's a kind of an essay which was composed by William Wordsworth, and this essay is itself a kind of a kind of gateway to understand what was Wordsworth's view regarding the his ideas regarding poetry. So it includes certain important ideas which are like ordinary life is the best subject for poetry, wherein he uses common man's language, fact that everyday language is best suited for poetry. Then expression of feeling is more important than action or plot, that is emotion. He gave importance to emotion here. Then poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, as we just discussed, that takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. So he talks about these things in his preface, which is an essay which was composed by William Wordsworth for the second edition, which was published in 1800 and 1801, during this time, and it got greatly expanded in 1802. So you will get somewhere as 1800 and somewhere as 1801. So around 1800 and 1801, when the second edition was published, that is when the lyrical preface to the lyrical ballads came to discussion, right? So this is the main idea of what we are discussing, and we are kind of going to analyze his ideas further, what he sees or he writes in preface to the lyrical ballad. So Wordsworth's idea of nature. So Wordsworth admired nature and countryside, not only because it looked beautiful, but because of the simplicity and beauty that nature or countryside provided. So what did he see? What did he kind of look for? He was kind of looking for what? He was looking for the simplicity which was there in the language which was used by people who were near nature, right? And from where did they get that simplicity? According to Wordsworth, that simplicity was derived from the language of nature. That is the way nature deals with you. That is what makes you simple or gets you simplicity as well. So because of the simplicity and beauty that nature and countryside provided, allowed people to be in touch with their soul and experience true beauty in life. So what allowed them to see the true beauty in life? So the true beauty in life was brought in by the beauty of nature which is there. So what is the beauty of nature? The beauty of nature lies in the simplicity which is there in and around nature. Right. So this is what Wordsworth is saying when his second edition of lyrical ballads was published in 1800. So in 1800, when he was actually writing publishing the second edition of the lyrical ballads, he added this preface in the form of an essay. So Wordsworth believed that the city life made the masses dull and stagnant. So a kind of contrast to that. So the masses, that is the people who are living in the cities, they become dull and stagnant. It had reduced them to overworked machines who failed to appreciate the simple beauty of life. So the simple beauty of life was not appreciated by the people who are kind of there in the cities. So according to him, people living in the cities, they do not have that kind of simplicity which he is looking for. Because the city people, they are more interested in their own things. They are more interested in their selfish interests. They are more interested in the competitive world. But they do not have the language of simplicity, which he actually wishes to have. They are in their own way, in their own kind of complex nature of existence. And that is what he doesn't want. He is saying that if you want to actually understand what is the true beauty of nature, if you have to understand what is the true way in which poetry should be written, then you need to go near nature and learn the language of nature, the simplicity which is there in nature. Only then what will happen is that you will be able to enjoy nature, as well as your poetry will give us the idea of what nature looks like. So this is what he talks about. Next, the question is, what inspires poetry? So in my channel, which is Krishna's Canvas, you will see that I have kind of made one audiobook, which is The World is Too Much with Us by William Wordsworth. So if possible, you listen to that audiobook from the channel, which is The World is Too Much with Us. If you read that poem, then the ideas which we are discussing over here regarding his concept of why human beings are going away from nature and they should learn the beauties of nature, and how getting near to nature is very much called for, how it is the thing which we need to focus on, is kind of discussed, right? So The World is Too Much with Us, it's there in the form of audiobook in my channel, which is Krishna's Canvas, to get a feel of what exactly Wordsworth is trying to say, or what exactly Preface to the Lyrical Ballads is trying to tell us, right? So you can refer to that after our lecture series, the poem from the audio book channel Krishna's Canvas. Now we were discussing what inspires poetry. So tired of highly elevated topics of neoclassical poets and their overcomplicated language, Wordsworth wanted to make the ordinary extraordinary. So this is very important to understand, that he wanted to make the ordinary extraordinary. And by ordinary, what does he mean? Ordinary, he means the common people who are near to nature. And he wanted to make them the subject of poetry. So Wordsworth found inspiration from everyday figures of everyday life, whether it be the famous solitary reaper or the daffodils. Wordsworth's poetry flows to admire the simple beauty that exists in daily life. So what happens, whenever we get free time, what do? We run to a shopping mall nearby us. We kind of have a burger from the Burger King or McD, or we have some kind of, dish from any of these newly existing effects of materialism, effects of a kind of westernization of our society. Instead of doing that, if we go to some place, be it the mountains or be it the beach, the sea, or any particular aspect of nature, what happens? We learn many simple things. We learn simplicity. We can see the common people who are living there, who are at one with nature, how their life is not so complicated, how their mind is much, kind of relaxed than the way it is now, with the people living in the cities who are always, kind of after one ambition and then another ambition, and always trying to do that, one after another, instead of enjoying life in the true sense of the term. So if you read Wordsworth's Solitary Reaper or the Daffodils, his poems, then you will see that in each poem, in the daffodils, he is talking about how the sight of so many daffodils blooming together actually made his heart dance out of joy. Solitary Reaper, how the view of that particular solitary reaper and the song. So these things were so unique and so close to the heart of William Wordsworth, right? So we are seeing that he is saying that the inspiration for poetry can be derived from different paths or different aspects of nature, rather from nature itself. That is why he is stating that according to him, what is or how can we create poetry, or what is the origin of poetry? Then it is the emotions recollected in tranquility. So these emotions which are triggered in our heart by the different elements of nature, it's not just any emotion, but the emotion which is triggered by the beautiful images of nature. Now, who is a poet according to him? So, as we discussed, it's simply a man speaking to men, a fellow human, just like all of us, trying to communicate his perception and experience of truth and beauty. So somebody who is trying to do what? Trying to communicate what? Communicate his perception and experience of what? Of truth and beauty. However, the poet differs from regular people because of his higher sensitivity to the happenings around him and a deeper connection with his own feelings, moods, and emotions as they arise in response to these outer happenings. So, usually, if you are a writer or a poet, you will see that you have a more sensitive soul, because you pay more attention to the small things which are happening around you. Those small incidents and things touch you. Your feelings, your moods, and your emotions, they are kind of, these emotions and feelings and mood, these are getting connected, or you have a more sense of connection to these feelings, right? However, the people, the ordinary people who are not poets, they are busy in their own world. They are not so sensitive towards the things which are happening around them. However, a poetic soul will be able to communicate his perception and experience of truth and beauty, the strong emotions of truth and beauty, in a much better way because of their way of perceiving it. So the same incident which a person who is not a poet will perceive and a person who is a poet will perceive will be completely different. For example, all of you are watching a match, right, and you are supporting your team, and when your team wins, you will see that a person with poetic capability will put up a post which is very nicely put together. However, you will also be touched by that, but it won't touch you so much that you will write a poem out of it. Or there is a sad incident which happens around you, in your locality. You will feel bad, you will feel sad, and then you forget that thing. But a poetic soul will be so touched by it that the poetic soul might create a poem out of that. So this is exactly what Wordsworth is saying, that a poetic soul is a man speaking to men in his own voice. And when he is speaking about his own perceptions and his perceptions and experiences of truth in his own language, right? Next is, what is a poem? So Wordsworth famously defined poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings which are recollected in tranquility. Now, tranquility is also important, because until and unless we are in a tranquil environment, we do not, or we cannot focus properly, right? Only then we can focus. So, simply speaking, the highly sensitive poet is able to experience the beauty of ordinary life, capture his own emotions as they arise, and is finally able to sit in a calm, peaceful space to use his imagination to recollect these emotions and finally write about them. So basically what is happening, so a very sensitive soul, the poet is having a very sensitive soul. That very sensitive soul is able to experience the beauty of ordinary life and capture his own emotions as they arise. And so you are watching a very ordinary thing, perhaps a small bird chirping outside the window, a very ordinary thing in life, but a poet will find beauty out of it, and he will capture his own emotions in response to that particular incident, that particular event, that particular thing which is happening. And finally, he is going to, or she is going to sit in a calm place, calm, peaceful place, to use his or her imagination to recollect. That is, you are reimagining that situation, that sequence, that scene, and you are trying to recollect these emotions, and finally you are able to write about them. When you are writing about them, basically you are creating that poem. Now, what is the language in which a poem should be written? Real language of men. So the language to be used is real language of men. And what kind of language do we speak? A common human being, we use normal language. Again, you go to a kind of place, for example, you to go to a Konkan region where people are living near to nature, and they are not very belonging to a very high class society, rather are very much at one with nature, working with nature every day. You will see that their language will be again different. So it's ordinary daily language. That is what Wordsworth says that we need to use, should be used to write poetry. However, Wordsworth refined his common language to a purer form without losing the essence of its simplicity. So now we might argue that when we are reading Wordsworth's poetry, his language is quite good. So basically, he has retained the simplicity of the language of the common ordinary people, and then used his own language for that particular idea. Then there is this concept of the egotistical sublime. So it is a concept which simply means that a poet's own subjective view of truth and beauty is extremely attached to his work. The poems they produce are filled with their own imagination and perspective on how they perceive things around them. Wordsworth's works are often said to be examples of the egotistical sublime, since his own experience of things is what he believes to be everyone's experience of things. So, if we read his idea of what is a poetry, then only we will see that he is talking about the emotions of a poet. He is directly stating that your poetry, your work, your creation is a product of your view. And what kind of view? Your subjective view. That is your personal, your emotionally connected view of truth and beauty, the ultimate kind of emotions and feelings and thoughts which we are trying to convey. And hence, you are, if we talk about writing poetry in respect to Wordsworth's view, then it is kind of connected to the idea of your own ego, of your own idea of the self. So, if we are reading a poetry of William Wordsworth, then we are able to connect with his feelings of that particular subject. As a result, his poems are examples of egotistical sublime. This brings us to the next very significant critic or romantic critic, who is S.T. Coleridge, wherein Wordsworth and Coleridge came together for their work Lyrical Ballads, and they have been together for a long time. So Coleridge takes the trouble to examine and correct Wordsworth's views on language and meter. He wrote his major work, which is Biographia Literaria, which includes some brilliantly perceptive literary criticism. So Coleridge acutely remarks that Wordsworth's own theory of language is based on a selection of the language of rustics. So for Coleridge, if the provincial terms of speech from a peasant's language are removed, the rustic language will no longer be there. So for Coleridge, for a peasant's language, the terms of provincial terms of speech. So if the provincial terms of speech from a peasant's language are removed, the rustic language will no longer be there. So he is questioning Wordsworth's idea of language and meter, and when Wordsworth is saying that we need to use the rustic language. So he denies Wordsworth's main assertion that a special virtue is in the speech of those in close communication with nature. So till now, we discussed in details about William Wordsworth and how Wordsworth was constantly stating that your language which you are using for poem should be the language of a common man. And by common man, he was talking about a rustic man, and a rustic man who is near to nature, who is close to nature. And according to him, the simplicity which is there in nature becomes a part of the language used by the people who are around nature or who are close to nature. So, we see that Wordsworth had his own views regarding language and meter, but Coleridge questions his views on language and meter, and he questions how the speech of those who are in close communication nature is different. So he agrees with Wordsworth that much of the verse of the preceding generation is false and artificial, that is the neoclassical poetry. On the question of meter, he affirms that there is diction that is appropriate in metrical language and not in prose. So he is kind of talking about meter and how meter is not there in prose, but it is a part of poetry. Moreover, there are phrases that are acceptable in prose that would not be in poetry. So he is kind of differentiating between the prose and poetry genres. He finalizes his argument by providing, or rather proving, that Wordsworth did not follow his own theory. So, according to him, Wordsworth did not follow his own theory. So, Coleridge's contributions to criticism go far beyond his corrections of Wordsworth's slips or his gaps. So, Coleridge's contribution we are going to discuss. So, in the realm of practical criticism, his discussion of Shakespeare is one of the Alps of English criticism. So, he has kind of criticized Wordsworth for some of his views, but his contribution goes far beyond his criticism. So, Coleridge's view of poetry is organic, not mechanical. So, what kind of view Coleridge had? So, Coleridge's view of poetry is organic, and it is not what? It is not mechanical. Real poetry is the union of the heart and the head. So he is saying that heart and head should come together when we create poetry. And it can never be measured by yardsticks. So real poetry is born out of the union of the heart and the head. And it can never be measured by the yardstick. So you cannot actually measure the intensity of real poetry. So Coleridge gives the definition of a poem as that a poem is that species of composition. It is opposed to works of science, and by proposing for its immediate object pleasure, not truth. So he is talking about the idea of what? He is talking about the idea of pleasure. So he is saying that Coleridge gives the definition of a poem that a poem is that species of composition. Which species of composition? This composition, which is a result of the union of the heart and the head, right? So this is an example. Poetry is an example of that. And then it is opposed to the works of science. Why is it opposed to the works of science? Because science or any object of science is directed towards what? Towards attaining truth. But poetry is about what? Its immediate object is the object of pleasure. So immediate object is pleasure. So this is what the main idea of poetry, the idea of poetry according to Coleridge is. And it leads to something termed as suspension of disbelief. Because again, the subject which Coleridge chose for his poetry was different from Wordsworth. Then Coleridge's view of the poet. So the poet is born, not made. So according to him, poet is born and a poet cannot be made. Why? Because he thinks that a poet is kind of a special in his own way. The shaping power of the poet's imagination is that, or is what gives poetry its distinction. So the shaping power of the poet's imagination does what? Gives poetry its distinction. So here he gives emphasis to what? He gives emphasis to imagination. Whose imagination? Poet's imagination. Because the shaping power of the poet's imagination, according to him, actually gives poetry its distinction or its special quality. According to Coleridge, imagination creates new shapes and forms of beauty by fusing and unifying the different impressions it receives from the external world. So according to Coleridge, what happens? What does imagination do? Imagination creates new shapes and forms of beauty by fusing and unifying the different impressions it receives from the external world. So, from the external world, we receive different kinds of impressions, right? So, he is saying that our imagination creates new shapes and forms of beauty. And how does it do that? It does it by fusing, that is, it by bringing together, unifying what? The different impressions it receives from the external world. So, mixing them, it creates new shapes. What? The imagination. So, the poet's imagination is what gives poetry its distinction or its difference. For Coleridge, imagination is the very soul of poetry. So, what is the very soul of poetry? Imagination, which forms all into one graceful and intelligent whole. For example, all of you perhaps won't be a poet, but when you are writing an answer during your examination, it is your ability. If, for example, you are writing an essay, you have been asked to write essay on a topic which you have kind of not prepared, you have not actually learned by heart and gone. You are writing an essay on the spot by bringing together all your experiences which you have in your life related to that topic. You bring them together and you give shape to it, you give life to it. So, this is what a poet is doing, his imagination is doing. He is creating new shapes and forms by fusing and unifying the different impressions which he gets from the external world. He calls imagination a synthetic and magical power. So, what kind of power? A synthetic and magical power. This power of imagination reveals itself in the fusion and reconciliation of opposites into one. So, even if there are opposite ideas, you reconcile them, that is, you bring them together to fuse them and make them one. Now, before moving on to P.B. Shelley, one of the ideas of Coleridge, which we already referred to, which is suspension of disbelief, that you need to keep in mind. So, what is that? Is the avoidance, often described as willing, of critical thinking and logic in understanding something that is unreal or impossible in reality, such as something in a work of speculative fiction, in order to believe it for the sake of enjoying its narrative. So, if we talk about Coleridge, then Coleridge talks about the suspension of disbelief, wherein he says that we need to allow oneself to believe that something is true, even though it seems impossible. So, even though it seems impossible, you think of kind of believing in it. So, you can, read about Coleridge, and you can read Coleridge's poems. In Coleridge's poems, you will see, his poetry. Mainly, he talks about imagination, as we discussed, and he talks about certain things which are perhaps not possible in reality, something which is kind of a part of his imagination, and he asks the readers to exercise suspension of disbelief in order to kind of understand the main message of that particular poem. For example, if you read Coleridge's poem, which is Christabel, then you will see that how, there is this whole imaginary world which is created, and the idea of Geraldine and Christabel. So these ideas are created, and you are asked to have this idea of suspension of disbelief in order to believe in them. Now, this brings us to the next romantic critic, who is P.B. Shelley. So, P.B. Shelley, in A Defense of Poetry, talks about his belief in literary criticism and romantic literary criticism. So, A Defense of Poetry is an unfinished essay by P.B. Shelley, Percy B. Shelley, written in February and March of 1821, that the poet put aside and never completed. The text was published posthumously in 1840 in essays, letters from abroad, translations, and fragments. Its final sentence expresses Shelley's famous proposition that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. So, what are the poets? Poets are the unacknowledged legislators or legislators of the world. And this line in itself sums what Shelley wants to say. Now, this essay, what happened? This essay, which essay we are talking about? We are talking about this particular essay, A Defense of Poetry. A Defense of Poetry was written in response to his friend Thomas Love Peacock's article, The Four Ages of Poetry. So this was also a response. And a response from what? Response to his friend Thomas Love Peacock's article, The Four Ages of Poetry, which had been published in 1820. Now, Shelley wrote to the publishers Charles and James Ollier, who were also his own publishers. What did he write? This is very important. This is what he has written. I am enchanted with your literary miscellany, although the last article has excited my polemical faculties so violently that the moment I get rid of my ophthalmia, I mean to set about an answer to it. It's very clear, but I think very false. Next, he writes another. He writes to Peacock. And what does Shelley write? He writes, your anathemas against poetry itself excited me to a sacred rage. So he was transformed into a sacred rage, sacred anger. I had greatest possible desire to break a lance with you in honor of my mistress Urania. So, anathemas against poetry excited him to a sacred rage, to a sacred anger. And I had the greatest possible desire to break a lance with you in honor of my mistress Urania. So these are the two exact writings of Shelley, which you can refer to understand his writing style. So the text we know as A Defense of Poetry was eventually published 18 years after Shelley's death, after being subjected to some editing by John Hunt and Shelley's wife, Mary Shelley, in her essays, Letters from Abroad, Translations and Fragments. So, this is how his essays were, or his essay was published. So, for Shelley, poets are not only authors of language and of music, of the dance and architecture and statuary and paintings. They are the institutions of law and the founders of civil society. So, it's not about, they been talking about language or music, dance, architecture, or statuary and painting, but they are rather what? They are institutions of laws. And this particular term is very important because this is what he gave most importance to. According to him, a poet is also having this role, which is the role of the institutors of laws and the founders of civil society. So social and linguistic order are not the sole products of the rational faculty as languages. Why? Because language is arbitrarily produced by the imagination. So if we are reading this, we will be reminded about structuralism and the idea that a language is arbitrary. because if you remember our discussions on sign, on signifier and signified being the constitutes of a sign, wherein language is arbitrary, there is no scientific reason as to why we call a cat, right? So he is also saying the same thing, and is saying that a language, or as language is arbitrarily produced by the imagination and reveals the before unapprehended relations of things and perpetuates their apprehension of higher beauty and truth. So what does that reveal? Reveals the before unapprehended relations of things and perpetuates their apprehension of higher beauty and truth. Shelley's conclusive remark that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, which is the most important line of the entire essay, suggests his awareness of the profound ambiguity. What? The profound ambiguity. That is confusion. That is kind of, a state where you cannot give one perfect answer. So ambiguity inherent in linguistic means. So his awareness of the profound ambiguity inherent in the linguistic means, which he considers at once as an instrument. So he considers it at once as an instrument of what? Of intellectual freedom. So he considers at once as an instrument of intellectual freedom and a vehicle for political and social subjugation. So Shelley's conclusive remark, which is very important, which is poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. What does it suggest? It suggests his awareness. And awareness about what? Awareness of the profound ambiguity which is inherent, which is there in linguistic means, which he considers at once as an instrument of what? Of the intellectual freedom and a vehicle for what? For political and social subjugation. So you have to keep this in mind, that the intellectual freedom and vehicle for political and social subjugation is brought in. So the profound ambiguity which is inherent in the linguistic means, because language is made up of this arbitrarily produced by imagination. As a result of that, it is an instrument of intellectual freedom and a vehicle for political and social subjugation, according to Shelley. Now, Shelley has explained his lofty view of poetry in a prose essay, which is a defense of poetry. And poetry was to him what religion is to most people, an idealization of life. So what is poetry? Poetry is an idealization of life. According to Shelley, a poem is the very image of life expressed in external truth. So what is poetry or a poem? A poem is the very image of life expressed in what kind of truth? The external truth, the eternal truth, the ultimate truth. So it is the image of life which is expressed in the form of truth, a truth which is eternal, which is universally acknowledged, which is universally true. So he defines poetry as the expression, as what? As the expression of the imagination. So he is also giving importance to what? He is giving importance to imagination as contradistinguished from that of the reason. So he is distinguishing from the reason. He conceives that the functions or objects of poetical faculty are twofold. The functions or objects of poetical faculty are twofold. By one, it creates new materials of knowledge and power and pleasure. By the other, it engenders in the mind a desire to reproduce and arrange them according to a certain rhythm and order, which may be called the beautiful and the good. So, he defines poetry as the expression of the imagination, as contradistinguished from that of the reason, and he conceives that the functions or objects of poetical faculty are twofold. By one, what does it do? By one, it creates new materials of knowledge and power and pleasure. By the other, it engenders in the mind a desire to reproduce and arrange them according to certain rhythm and order, which may be called the beautiful and the good. So it engenders in the mind a desire to what? To reproduce and arrange them according to a certain rhythm and order, which may be called the beautiful and the good. So this is how he talks about the idea of poetry. A great poem is not produced by reason, by study, or by any kind of hard work. The poets, if you remember the first slide, which we were talking about Shelley in the first slide, we were talking about the fact that he is saying that the poets are born and they are not made. Now, since they are not made, that is, they cannot be prepared. You cannot prepare a poet. You can prepare a scholar. You can prepare a learned man. But a poet or being able to write poetry is inborn, according to Shelley. So he is saying that a great poem is not produced by your reasoning capability, by any kind of study, or by any kind of hard work. Rather, what happens is that the poets are born and they cannot be made. The poetical power arises from within. The poetical power comes from within, from inside. So you will see that some of your cousins or any one of you might be a very good poet. But even if you have another sibling, you have a brother or sister who is there with you, who is seeing you write poetry, even though is really interested in writing poetry, perhaps won't be able to do that, because you need some kind of skill in being able to, some kind of creativity, some kind of skill, some kind of edge over others in being able to write poetry. So poetry is the record of the best and happiest moment of the best and happiest minds. So what does poetry record? So poetry is the record of the best and happiest moment. So a particular moment in life and the best and happiest minds. So until and unless you are happy, you are satisfied with yourself, it is very difficult to kind of have or to kind of write poetry. So the poet embodies in his verse the evanescent visitations of divine nature, which has come into his own. So it is a kind of bringing together of the things which are there in your mind, which is of divine nature, which kind of have in your mind, and which is a part of himself. So the poet embodies in his verse the visitations of a divine nature which has come into his own. So it is his happiest moments, in his state of being happy, that he kind of captures in his poetry or in his poems. Poetry thus makes, what does it make? It makes the immortal all that is best. So it makes immortal all that is best and most beautiful in the world. So whatever is beautiful in the world, which is existing in this happy moment of the poet, that is made immortal. How it is immortal? Because if you write down something, if you write your name on the sand, then it will be washed, right? But if you write your emotions, in a piece of paper, it gets published or it gets stored somewhere, then what happens? It becomes immortal. Today also we are reading Shelley, today also we are reading Keats, we are reading all the romantic poets and critics. It's because they have become immortal by the very dint of the fact that whatever they have written, they have passed the test of time and we are still reading them. So poetry makes immortal all that is best and most beautiful in the world. So whatever is beautiful in the world, that is kind of poetry makes it immortal. Now poetry is ever accompanied with what? With pleasure. Poetry is indeed something divine. It is at once the center and circumference of all knowledge. So it is the center and circumference of all knowledge. Poetry turns all things to loveliness. It exalts the beauty of that which is most beautiful, and it adds beauty to that which is most deformed. So it exalts the beauty. It increases the beauty of that which is most beautiful. Something which is already beautiful, what does it do? It makes it more beautiful. And then what? It kind of adds beauty to things which is most deformed. So if something is not beautiful, then also it adds beauty to it. So poetry turns all things to loveliness. So poetry is ever accompanied with pleasure. Poetry is indeed something divine. It is at once the center and circumference of all knowledge. It makes immortal all that is best and most beautiful in nature. And it is the record of the best and happiest moment. This brings us to the next romantic critic, who is John Keats. And John Keats's, there are so many poems which you can actually read, and his philosophy, his idea of life comes across through them. However, the point which we are going to discuss is termed as negative capability, for which Keats is very well known, and you get many questions from here. So, what is negative capability? Several things dovetailed in my mind, and at once struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean, negative capability. That is when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So, what happens is that he is talking about a negative capability, and he's saying that when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, then he's terming that as his negative capability. So, capability of being or existing in what? In uncertainties, in mysteries, in doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Coleridge, for instance, would let go by a fine, isolated verisimilitude caught from the penetralium of mystery, from being incapable of remaining content with half knowledge. So he is saying that, he's talking about Shakespeare, and he's saying that Shakespeare was capable of having it a lot. What? Negative capability. And when he's saying negative capability, he's explaining it as the capability of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So clearly he is using the word negative, not in any pejorative sense, but to convey the idea that a person's potential can be defined. So his capability, his potentiality, a person's potentiality can be defined not only by the things which he knows, but can be defined by what he or she does not possess. And that in itself is something interesting. So he's saying that a person's potential can be defined by what he or she does not possess. So usually what do we see? That, oh, this person has good painting skill, so he is a very good painter, very good. He say that he or she can sing very well, so he is a very good singer, so that is his capability, his potentiality. Or we say that he is a poet, so he is having good skills in writing poetry, he is creative. We say all these things, right? But how many times we think that a person's potential or his capability, his skill, his quality can be defined by what he or she does not possess, right? In this case, a need to be clever, a determination to work everything out. Essentially, to literary achievement, Keats argues, is a certain passivity, a willingness to let what is mysterious or doubtful remain just that. So he is saying that if we are not aware of something, there is a mystery, then leaving it just as it is what is, we are talking about the literary achievement. So essential to literary achievement, Keats argues, is a certain passivity. That is, you are passive, you are not kind of trying to do something. What? Passivity, a willingness to let what is mysterious or doubtful remain just that. So, allowing things which are mysterious to remain mysterious. Allowing the things which are doubtful to remain doubtful. And being passive towards it. That is, not being very active to uncode or rather to decode them, right? This is what he's terming as negative capability. Clearly, he is using the word negative, not in a, so if we can kind of sum up the ideas which we just discussed, that he is using negative not in a pejorative sense, but to convey the idea that a person's potential can be defined by what he or she does not possess, which we have to keep in mind. In this case, I need to be clever, determination to work everything out. Essential to literary achievement, Keats argues, is a certain passivity, a willingness to let what is mysterious or doubtful to remain just that. And he ends his brief discussion of negative negative capability by concluding that with a great poet, the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather obliterates all consideration. So the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather kind of omits all other considerations. So what becomes very important? The sense of beauty. Other things are overcome by this sense of beauty, or other things are overcome or obliterated by this consideration. Now, with this we kind of wrap up the consideration of the Romantic age critics, and we have some time, so we will kind of discuss Indian Rasa theory. After we discuss Indian Rasa theory, we are going to do the Victorian age critics, which will be the last segment of our discussion on literary criticism. So, Indian Rasa theory. In Indian aesthetics, a rasa or ras literally means nectar, essence, or taste. Now, since net, we do get some questions on Indian literary criticism, or the base of Indian literary criticism, which is Indian rasa theory. That is why we are kind of going ahead with this discussion. So in Indian aesthetics, rasa or ras literally means nectar, essence, or taste. It is a concept in Indian arts denoting the aesthetic flavor of any visual, literary, or musical work that evokes an emotion or feeling in the reader or audience but cannot be described. So, in Indian aesthetics, so when we introduced the Indian literary, introduced literary criticism lecture in lecture 1. We discussed that we are also going to discuss Indian rasa theory, and when we are saying rasa or ras, Sanskrit ras, it literally means nectar, essence, or taste. And all of us must have heard this term ras or rasa, because we keep on using it. For example, any juice of any fruit, we talk about the ras. So we kind of say that, kind of get the ras out of it, and the other part, the extra part can be thrown away, right? So Indian aesthetics or rasa literally means the nectar, essence, or taste. And it is a concept in Indian arts denoting the aesthetic flavor of any visual, literary, or musical work. Aesthetic flavor of any visual, literary, or musical work that evokes, that is, that gives birth to an emotion or feeling in the reader or audience. So what does it evoke? So it denotes the aesthetic flavor of any visual or literary or musical work that generates an emotion or feeling. And where does it generate that? It generates that feeling in the reader or the audience. So it denotes, or it creates that in the reader or the audience, that emotion or feeling which cannot be described in words. Something beyond that, a feeling which can be only felt. So rasas are created by one's bhava, or one's state of mind, or bhav. We say that bhav gives birth to the rasa or the rasas. So rasas are created by one's bhava, that is bhav, that is one's state of mind. So Indian aesthetics is based on rasa theory, rasa or ras, which literally means nectar, essence, or taste. And it is a concept in Indian arts which denotes the aesthetic flavor. The word aesthetic is very important here. Not any kind of flavor, but the aesthetic flavor of what kind of visual. It can be visual, for example, you are seeing a drama. It can be literary, wherein you are reading something. Or it can be a musical or musical work, a musical, for example. It's a kind of a drama in the form of a musical drama, right? So it evokes an emotion or a feeling in the reader or audience, but that cannot be described. And there are 8 rasas in the Natya Shastra. So Bharat Muni enunciated the 8 rasas in the Natya Shastra, an ancient Sanskrit text of dramatic theory and other performance arts, written between 200 BC and 200 AD. So Bharat Muni enunciated what? He enunciated the 8 rasas in the Natya Shastra. He enunciated 8 rasas. We have to keep that in mind. An ancient, what is this? Natya Shastra, an ancient Sanskrit text of the dramatic theory. From the word Natya, that is drama, you can understand that it is a Shastra or a kind of book on Natya or drama. So the Sanskrit text of dramatic theory and other performances or performance arts, which was written between 200 BC and 200 AD. In the Indian performing arts, a rasa is a sentiment or emotion evoked in each member of the audience by the art. So, rasa is a sentiment or emotion which is evoked in what? In each member of the audience by that particular art. Now, first one is Shringara or romance, love, attractiveness. The presiding deity or god of this is Vishnu, and the color is light green. Next is Hasyam. Hasyam is talking about what? Is talking about laughter, mirth, comedy. Presiding deity is Shiva. The color is white. Then is Raudram. Raudram is fury, and the presiding deity is Shiva. The color is red. So Raudram is fury, presiding deity is Shiva, and the color is red. Then is Karunam or Karunam. So it's compassion, mercy. Presiding deity is Yama, and the color is gray. So you can understand when we are saying Karuna, it is talking about compassion, it is talking about mercy, right? And the presiding deity of that is Yama, and the color is gray. Next is Bibhatsam, which is Bibhatsa. We can understand Bibhatsam, we get the word Bibhatsa from it, which is disgust, aversion, and the presiding deity is Shiva, color is blue. Then we have Bhayanakam, which is Bhayanak from the word Bhayanak, which is horror and terror. And the presiding deity is Yama. The color is black. Next is Viram, which is heroism. Presiding deity is Indra. Color is saffron. And then is Adbhutam. Adbhutam gives us the idea from the word Adbhut. Adbhut talks about Adbhutam, that is wonder or amazement. That is wonder or amazement, which is the kind of the beauty which you see, wherein you the wonder, the amazement which in so the wonder which is there, so wonder, amazement, which are kind of triggered by different expressions and different ideas, right? So the presiding deity, that is God, is Brahma. The color is yellow. So these are the 8 rasas in the Natya Shastra. So we will quickly go through the 8 rasas once again. So the first rasa is the rasa of Shringara, and then we have Hasyam, then we have Raudram, then we have Karunayam, then Bibhatsam, then Bhayanakam, then Viram, then Adbhutam, right? So these are all the different kind of emotions and sentiments which are aroused in the audience. So when we are watching a drama, then any of these emotions are going to be aroused. So this is what is the theory of 8 rasas enunciated by Bharat Muni, and which we can find in the book, which is Natya Shastra, an ancient Sanskrit text of dramatic theory and other performing arts, which was written between 200 BC and 200 AD, right? So it talks about the emotion of romance, talks about the emotion of laughter, of fury, anger, compassion, of disgust, aversion, horror or terror, heroism, and wonder or amazement. However, a ninth rasa was added later on, and this rasa is the rasa of santam, that is peace or tranquility. And that is santam. So shant, we say somebody is shant. It comes from shantam. So peace or tranquility, and its Vishnu is the deity, and the color is perpetual white. Now, what were the goals of theatre? Wherein the theatre was referring to these theories of 8 rasas. What was the goal? So, according to the Natya Shastra, the goals of theatre are to empower what? Empower aesthetic experience and deliver emotional rasa. So, according to the Natya Shastra, the goal of theatre are to empower aesthetic experience and deliver emotional rasa. The text states that the aims of art are manifold. In many cases, it aims to produce kind of repose and relief for those exhausted with labor or distraught with grief and or laden with misery or struck by austere times. However, entertainment is an effect, yet not the primary goal of arts according to Natya Shastra. The primary goal is to create rasa so as to lift and transport the spectators towards the expression of ultimate reality and transcendent values. So, these points which we see before us are the main goals of theatre according to Natya Shastra, which was propounded by Bharat Muni in his Sanskrit text Natya Shastra, talking about the 8 rasa. So, according to Natya Shastra, the goals of theatre are to empower aesthetic experience and deliver emotional rasa. So, this is what we have to remember. And there are other points or aims as well, like it aims to produce repose and relief. So, it produces some kind of relief for those exhausted with labor or who are distraught with grief or laden with misery or struck by austere times. So you will see that when we are really down, we are kind of distressed, we are really tired, for an emotional escape, we watch different movies or series now, right, in today's age. But if we talk about the time when Natya Shastra was written, during that time, the only source of entertainment was a drama, was a Natya. So he's saying that the aim of this art is manifold, including one of the aims being that you kind of provide relief to those exhausted souls which are kind of distraught with grief or are laden with misery or are struck by difficult times. So you get or lend that kind of effect to that particular mind. However, the main aim is not just that. So entertainment is a part of it, is one of the aims, but that is not the ultimate aim. So entertainment is an effect, yet not the primary goal of art. So it's not the primary or the main goal of arts according to Natya Shastra. And the primary goal is to create what? Is to create rasa. And rasa, the 8 rasas we have discussed, and the 9th rasa which got added later on, that also we discussed about santam, right? So, as to lift and transport the spectators towards the expression of ultimate reality and transcendental values. So, expression of ultimate reality and transcendental values. So, you will see that, if you read a piece of work, a piece of prose or poetry or novel as such, and then you get delighted at that moment, you get some entertainment out of that. So that is for that moment. But if you also get some ultimate reality, if you learn some transcendent values, that is some eternal values, universal values and facts from it, then you will see that you realize or you feel that piece of literature has a greater role to play. So it is very similar to what Natya Shastra is about, or the concept of delivering a particular emotional rasa to the audience. Right. So it's not only about entertaining, but also about leading them to a particular rasa, which transports the spectators towards what was the expression of some kind of ultimate reality and some kind of transcendent values, which is not existing otherwise. Right. So this is what is the aim of Indian Rasa theory. I just included that because we had 15 minutes time left after our discussion of romantic critics, and I didn't want to start with the Victorian critics today, which we will start with in the next lecture. So in those 15 minutes, we took up this topic of Indian Rasa theory because in recent net, you will see that there might be some questions from Indian literary criticism as well. So kind of cover that up. We discuss this topic, and then after in the next lecture we are going to start with the Victorian critics, as we have discussed in the very introductory lecture of literary theory, that literary criticism is the base of literary theory. And we are discussing literary criticism right from its base, that when it started, classical literary criticism, and then from kind of classical we moved on to the next, in each stage how it evolved and it developed. And today we discussed romantic critics, the romantic age literary critics, and then it moves on to the Victorian critics, wherein we are going to start with George Eliot and her criticism, and then move on to the other important thinkers of that particular age, important critics of that age. And as we complete Victorian literary criticism, it actually brings us back to the origin of literary theory. So after that, what comes is literary theory, which we have already we have already done. So herein, if there is any question, you can let me know. If not, we will be calling it a day for today. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining in. And look forward to seeing you all in the next session. Any questions, you can put it down. If okay, so yes, so I can see Rohit there online. So okay, fine, Rohit. So I don't know from where you have joined, but I will just quickly take you through the things which we have discussed today. So that I'm just sharing my screen for the last 5 minutes, which we still have in our hand. So we have kind of discussed the origin of the idea of the romantic age of critics, wherein we discussed William Wordsworth. We have discussed his idea of what should be a poetry like, how after French Revolution Romanticism started, how it proclaimed the rights of man, and how there was a distinct change in the focus of literary criticism, wherein it was going against the neoclassical, kind of idea of a particular poetic diction, and made way for the rustic language, and was not really interested in any kind of you can say that any kind of superficial or any kind of artificial language, rather wanted to include ordinary speech of men as a part of literature, as a part of their works. And then we discussed how we can describe a poet, and the best thing which we could say is that a man speaking to men, which we have to remember. And then we came across the idea of the definition of poetry, and the definition of poetry. So I'm just kind of discussing the main points for a few students who have joined in now. The poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. And then Wordsworth's view of meter, how preface to his lyrical ballads was important, and his idea of nature, and how he was talking about the simplicity and beauty that exists in nature. What inspires poetry? That is to make the ordinary extraordinary. That is what he mainly tried to say. Then, what is a poet? Poet is a man speaking to men. Again, the poem, the main idea, a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings which are recollected in tranquility. And then, real language of men, ordinary language of men should be used. Egotistical sublime, an important concept wherein it is as if that a poet's own subjective view of truth and beauty is attached to his work, and it is example of egotistical sublime since it talks about his own experience of things, and Wordsworth is an example of that. Then in S.T. Coleridge, it was important to talk about Biographia Literaria, his main work. So if you get a chance, you should read this work because this sums up his main literary criticism. And then the idea of how he was against Wordsworth's idea of use of the language of the common men. And then Coleridge's view of poem as something which is organic and not mechanical. His concept of suspension of disbelief, which I have already discussed and is still there in the recorded lecture, which you can refer to, wherein the suspension of disbelief is referring to the desire to actually suspend your kind of belief for that moment, to believe the things which are presented to you in that work. And then he calls imagination a synthetic and magical power. So then we discussed about P.B. Shelley, wherein his work A Defense of Poetry is an unfinished essay by P.B. Shelley written in February and March of 1821, which was again an unfinished work, but it talks about his belief, his criticism. Right. So he speaks about the fact that poets are not only authors of language and of music, of the dance and of painting, but the important thing is that they are institutions of laws and the founders of what? Founders of the civil society. So social and linguistic order are not the sole product of the rational faculty. So he was stating, this line is very important, that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. So he's talking about the arbitrariness of the way, produced by imagination, how language is arbitrary, how language is produced, and then defines poetry as the expression of the imagination, and that poetical power arises from within. One cannot become a poet, but rather poets are born. Then in case of Keats, we were talking about negative capability, which is a very important concept, because in negative capability, you are actually talking about what? You are talking about the fact that a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And this is what is termed as negative capability. So when we talk about Keats, his idea of negative capability is very, very important. So he is using the word negative not as a pejorative sense, that is not in a very negative sense, but to convey the idea that a person's potential can be defined by what he or she does not possess. So we tried to discuss this concept of how when we do not possess something, that can also lead to some addition to our personality or our capability. So discuss this, and then we moved on to Indian rasa theory and how rasa is meaning is nectar, essence, or taste, and the rasas are created by one's bhava, that is one's state of mind. And then the 8 rasas which we have discussed, moving on to the 9th rasa, and then finally the goal of Indian theatre, wherein the main goal is to create, deliver an emotional rasa, And then finally, it leads to the expression of an ultimate reality and transcendental value. However, entertainment is also one of the processes, but that entertainment is one of the effects, not the ultimate effect or the primary goal, wherein the ultimate goal is to reach that ultimate expression of the ultimate reality and transcendent values. So, to create rasa so as to lift and transport the spectators towards the expression of the ultimate reality and transcendent values. And with this, we come to the topic which we are going to start the next day, which is Victorian critics. And we are going to start with George Eliot. And in Eliot, we are going to start with the discussion of Eliot's realism. And what do we mean by Eliot's? Yes, Rohit, I will take up one session wherein for literary theory, I've already referred to the books which are needed in the last lecture. That is lecture number 6 of literary theory, wherein you can refer to the important books. For literary criticism also, the books list I will give in the last lecture. So stay tuned. You will get the names of the books as well. So Eliot's realism and how it's different and what are the characteristic effects of that. So with this, we will be calling it a day for today. So anybody else online, any questions, you can let me know. I hope, Rohit, you have got your answer. So the book list for literary criticism will be coming in the lecture number, the last lecture which we are taking for literary criticism. So I will be concluding with the name of the books. For literary theory, books I have already told in the last lecture as well. So with this, we will call it a day. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining in.